The day I went to ask for a divorce. I called Lu Shuming, but it was his secretary who answered. Her voice was youthful and sweet, with a hint of coyness. Director Lu is in a meeting right now. If you need anything, just tell me, and I'll pass the message along. She was the new woman in his life. This time, I didn't make a scene or cause any trouble. Calmly, I said, tell him I've left the divorce agreement on the bedside table. On my way to the airport, I called Lu Shuming again. A familiar, sugary voice answered. Ms. Su Lan, Director Lu is still in a meeting. Is there anything you'd like me to relay to him later? My hand froze, gripping the phone tightly. This was the woman who had caused so many fights between us over the past year. She hadn't even graduated from a top university. Yet she managed to land a job at a prestigious company like Yinhua just because Lu Shuming noticed her once during her interview. Over the last year, we had fought countless times because of her. I even stormed into the company, demanding HR to fire her. But Lu Shuming protected her fiercely. A year later, she was still by his side, unscathed, traveling with him everywhere as his secretary. Now, I was finally tired. This endless battle, I realized, was meaningless. I ignored the provocative tone in her voice, feeling nothing but fatigue as I calmly said, please tell him that I've left the divorce agreement on the bedside table. He just needs to sign it when he gets home. Before she could respond, I hung up. In the past, I imagined that if we ever reached the point of divorce, I'd cause a huge uproar, maybe even destroy our home. I thought that if I had to suffer, he wouldn't have peace either. But now that it had come to this, I felt an eerie sense of calm. I took nothing with me. Everything in that house, everything we had shared, disgusted me. The only thing I brought with me was myself. Before boarding the plane, Lu Shuming texted me. I saw the divorce agreement. What are you up to now? Even through the screen, I could imagine his irritated expression. I didn't reply. I switched my phone to airplane mode. We both knew the reason. After all, ever since Ha Linlin became his secretary, Lu Shuming had been coming home later and later. No lipstick stains, no strange perfume, but he was always glued to his phone, sometimes even smiling like a young man in love. I dropped hints a few times, but he always brushed it off, saying, there's nothing between us. You're overthinking. Because of Ha Linlin, we fought endlessly. I demanded he transfer her to another department, but he called me unreasonable. I cried, begged, raged, even became a madwoman in my attempts to make him see reason. I sat amidst broken dishes, threatening him with a shard of porcelain. But he just looked at me coldly and said, Su Lan, do you know how ugly you look right now? I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. Yes, ugly indeed. I was like a woman possessed. I loved him too much. Or maybe I had invested too much in him, unwilling to let go. Just the thought of losing him made my heart ache unbearably. To put it simply, I wasn't willing to give up. I had been by his side for 10 years, watching him rise from nothing to someone everyone now called Director Lu. How could a woman he'd only known for a year take him away from me? I started paying more attention to my appearance, learning new dishes, trying to be gentler, thinking that maybe I could win him back. But last night, when I went to pick him up after a night of drinking, I found him sitting with a young woman, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his long legs casually crossed, the sharp lines of his jaw softened under the streetlights. The handsome young man I once knew had grown even more attractive with time. Like a fine wine, maturing and becoming richer with age. I suddenly remembered the early days of our relationship when we used to sit by the roadside just like that. I'd bring him dishes I had just learned to make, and after taking a bite, he'd fall silent. I'd worry whether the food wasn't good. What's wrong? I'd ask. He'd look up, smile, and say, I'm just thinking, what kind of luck did I have to deserve such a wonderful wife? I'd blush. Amid the cold streets, he'd wrap me in his thick coat, speaking between breaths that turned into white puffs in the winter air. When I make it, I'll open a big restaurant with your name on it. The whole world will know how great a cook my wife is. I'd look up, and he'd look down. In his dark, beautiful eyes, the city lights shimmered, along with the reflection of my smiling face. That was so long ago. So long that if I hadn't seen him there with that girl, I might have forgotten. The boy who once had only me in his eyes had indeed become successful. But the woman beside him now was no longer me. How is it? Does it taste good? Ha Linlin asked, swinging her legs as she smiled. I made these grilled rice balls myself. It took a while. Lu Shuming held a simple rice ball in his hand, a gentle smile on his face. It's delicious. And suddenly, the soup I had simmered for 4 hours became a joke. Lu Shuming glanced up, noticing me for the first time. His movements froze, and his brow furrowed. "Why are you here?" Ha Linlin looked at me smugly, though she tried to disguise it. "You must be Ms. Su Lan, right?" She smiled brightly, stepping closer. "I never knew you were so beautiful. It's strange that Director Lu never mentioned you at the office. He had to drink with some contractors tonight, so he got a bit drunk." "Oh, is this the midnight snack you brought?" She reached for the box I was holding and opened it. The rich aroma of fish soup filled the air, mixed with the slight spiciness of peppercorns. She took a deep breath. "It smells amazing. Ms. Su Lan, you're quite talented." Then she looked at me with a smirk. "But unfortunately, Director Lu just finished dinner. I brought these grilled rice balls from home." She called him Shuming, a girl barely in her 20s. Her challenge was so blatant, so fearless, filled with the arrogance of youth. Perhaps Lu Shuming's favoritism had given her this boldness. I looked at him and said, "You'd rather eat trash outside than the good food at home, wouldn't you?" His face darkened. Ha Linlin wasn't offended, just smiled with her lips pressed together. "It's not about what you eat. Really, it's about who you eat it with. When you're with someone you love, even a simple meal becomes a feast. But when you're with someone you despise, even a lavish banquet tastes like wax. Isn't that right, Ms. Su Lan?" I glanced at her and sneered. "Yes, I suppose trash always tastes good to dogs." Her face turned pale, and she said nothing more. Lu Shuming stood up, his expression grim. "Su Lan, you've gone too far, not wanting to make a scene in public." I lowered my head. "Let's go home." He finished the rice ball in his hand, then called his driver. "Make sure she gets home safely," he said to the driver without hesitation. Right in front of me. Ha Linlin pouted and got into the car. Before leaving, she turned to look at him as if she wanted to act coy. I watched her walk away, her ponytail swinging behind her, her legs long and pale under her short white dress. She looked just like I had years ago. In fact, the resemblance between her brows and mine was almost eerie. I wasn't naive enough to think Lu Shuming was searching for a younger version of me in her. Perhaps he'd always had a thing for women like her, whether they were in their 20s or 30s. It was always girls just out of their youth. That night, I didn't argue with him. I just took my pillow and blanket and moved to the guest room. He didn't stop me. Before leaving, I asked him one final question. "Lu Shuming, what are you really thinking?" I had loved this man for 10 years. Even if this relationship was to end, I wanted to know why. He took a cigarette from the pack, held it between his fingers, and after a moment, said, "Su Lan, I'm tired." The orange flame flickered as he lit it. He took a deep drag, exhaling a cloud of smoke, and turned to look at me. "I'm tired of you hovering around me all the time, always asking what I want to eat, what I want to eat, what I want to eat." I married a wife, not a chef. Besides cooking 3 meals a day, is there anything else you know how to do? I looked at him for a long time, the smoke swirling between us, obscuring the image of the man who once held me close, telling me his dream was to eat my cooking for the rest of his life. That dream was now dissolving into the haze. At that moment, I finally understood. The husband I had loved was already gone, lost in the passage of time. The man standing before me was no longer the man I had fallen in love with. I said nothing more and turned to leave. The next day, Lu Shuming went to work as usual, as if nothing had happened. He didn't say a word about the events of the night before. Perhaps he didn't think it necessary to explain. In his mind, I would probably swallow my anger, pretend as if nothing had happened. But when I poured the now cold and fishy soup down the toilet, I went out immediately and drafted the divorce papers. Marriage is a lot like cooking. I suddenly realized, when a dish becomes inedible, there's no need to force yourself to eat it. As the plane took off, I gazed out the window at the towering buildings shrinking into the distance, soon hidden by clouds. I had come to this city for Lu Shuming. He wanted to move to the big city to start his career, and I had given up my culinary dreams to follow him. I still remember the regret in the restaurant owner's voice when I left. "You're the most promising chef we've had in years. If you stick with it, you'll go far. Why give it up?" My family had passed down culinary skills for generations, even earning royal recognition. I, too, wanted to carry on the Su family's legacy. But back then, my mind was only filled with Lu Shuming. My parents died young, in a car accident, before I could finish learning all the family recipes. I was raised by my grandmother. After she passed, I had no family left in this world. Sometimes I wonder if it was because I had met so few people in my life that I treasured Lu Shuming so much. That I endured and tolerated him again and again, all for the sake of holding on to him. He often skipped meals because of work, while I stayed home every day cooking 3 meals for him. To accommodate his schedule, I had given up on my own dreams and became nothing more than a housewife. The passion and aspirations I once had slowly faded away, leaving behind only the mundane worries of daily life. But I accepted it with a smile, because I loved him. I naively believed that love alone was enough. But looking back now, it feels laughable. In the end, if you can't hold on to something, it's gone forever. Like the lyrics of a song, if you can't grasp the sand, it's better to let go. It had been years since I returned to my hometown, and much had changed. The walls of the old neighborhood had been repainted, and new faces had replaced the old neighbors. Only the street in front of my house remained as lively as ever, filled with the aroma of grilled meat and beer by late afternoon. I bought a bunch of groceries, planning to treat myself to a nice meal. Lu Shuming had a sensitive stomach and couldn't eat spicy food, so over the years, I had catered to his tastes and rarely indulged in the spicy dishes I loved. While sitting on the bus, thinking about what I'd cook for dinner, someone suddenly collapsed beside me. Startled, I looked up to see a young man wearing a black hoodie, his head hanging low so I couldn't see his face clearly. His black hair was damp with sweat and clung to his forehead as he leaned against me, as if about to faint. A light scent of cigarettes mixed with lemon lingered in the stifling air of the bus. "Sorry," he said weakly, "I have low blood sugar. Do you have any candy?" Flustered, I tore open the packet of sugar I had just bought from the supermarket. "Will this work?" He glanced at the sugar in my hand and smiled faintly, a little helpless. "It'll do." With that, he bent his head slightly, his cold lips briefly brushing my palm as he took the sugar. My face flushed, and I quickly stood up to help him into a seat. "You should sit down." The young man took the sugar, ate a few grains, and then looked up. Beneath his tousled hair, his deep black eyes gleamed. The faint weakness and pallor had vanished, replaced with a hint of mischief and arrogance. "Thanks." Now that I could see him clearly, I realized he was quite handsome, probably only in his early 20s. With a straight nose and single eyelids that shimmered with a faint blush. His long, dark eyelashes, sharp like blades, added a captivating allure to his features. "It's nothing," I mumbled, unable to stop myself from sneaking another glance. I didn't think much of the encounter until I got home and started cooking, only to realize I'd run out of sugar and had to go back out to buy more. I took off my apron and headed downstairs, but the moment I opened the door, I froze in place. Standing at the door of the apartment next to mine, the young man from the bus was fumbling with his keys. When he saw me, his eyes lit up. "So it's you. Are you the new neighbor who just moved in?" I nodded. "What a coincidence." After a moment's thought, I politely asked, "Are you feeling better now?" He smiled. "I'm fine. Just got too busy today and forgot to eat." I wasn't planning on saying anything more, but seeing how young he was, I couldn't help but offer some advice. "You should take care of yourself. If you don't eat properly, you'll have stomach problems later." Despite his rebellious appearance, the young man nodded obediently. "Yes, ma'am. What smells so good? Is it something you're cooking?" "Yes, but I need to go get more sugar." He sniffed the air like a curious puppy. "It smells amazing. What are you making?" "Fish head tofu soup and a few other homestyle dishes. Would you like to try some?" I said it out of politeness, not expecting his eyes to light up. "Really? Sure, why not? Let me go get the sugar then." Before I could react, he grabbed my shopping bag, shoved one hand in his pocket, and waved me off with the other. "You go back and keep an eye on the stove. I'll be right back." Somehow, things had turned out this way. On my first day back in my hometown, I ended up having dinner with my new neighbor. As he ate, his cheeks puffed up like a squirrel's as he mumbled, "Su Lan, you're such a good cook." I glanced at the young man, whose name I had learned was Yi Ming. He was clearly much younger than me, but ever since learning my name, he had taken to calling me Su Lan rather than addressing me as sister. During dinner, I found out that he had started his own business and was currently in the busiest phase, doing the work of 3 people himself because his company was short-staffed, which left him too busy to even eat. You wouldn't believe it, but I've been living off instant noodles for a whole week. It's been ages since I've had a proper meal like this. I glanced at the black Richard Mille watch on his wrist. If I wasn't mistaken, Lu Shuming had a similar one in his collection. Its retail price was enough to buy a Mercedes-Benz G-Class. And it was so exclusive that even money couldn't always guarantee you'd get one. This young man, wearing a small fortune on his wrist, was now holding a bowl of rice and blinking his dark eyes at me. Could I have another bowl, please? I couldn't help but chuckle as I nodded. That night, nearly the entire pot of rice I had planned to save for tomorrow's fried rice was devoured by Yi Ming. He ate so much that I found myself glancing at his stomach, wondering where all that food was going. Perhaps sensing my gaze, he sheepishly offered to help with the dishes after we finished eating. Need help with anything else? He asked, peeking his head out of the kitchen. I thought for a moment. The light bulb in the hallway is broken. Could you change it for me? I had said it without much thought, not expecting him to actually go out and buy a new bulb and replace it for me. As he stood on a chair, reaching up to change the light, his hoodie lifted slightly, revealing his toned abs beneath. I couldn't help but take another look. And then another. To my surprise, Yi Ming caught me staring. He smirked and asked, like what you see? Want me to pull the shirt up a little more so you can get a better view? Startled, I took a step back, waving my hands frantically. No, that's not necessary. Even after he left, the image of those abs stayed vividly in my mind. That night, I thought I'd have trouble sleeping, considering I had just decided to get a divorce. But perhaps Yi Ming had distracted me enough that I didn't dwell on Lu Shuming anymore. I slept soundly. A few days later, I strolled around the neighborhood, scouting potential spaces. I had decided to return to my roots and resume pursuing the dream I had once abandoned. I was going to start by opening a small restaurant. As the sun began to set, I sat on the couch, flipping through old recipe books when my phone suddenly rang. I glanced at the screen and saw that it was Lu Shuming. 3 days had passed since we last spoke about the divorce, and this was the first time he had called me since. Why haven't you come home? His voice was as impatient as ever, as if I were doing something unreasonable. I calmly replied, Lu Shuming, I'm not coming back. Are you really serious about the divorce? He scoffed. Su Lan, how long are you going to keep up this act? I was tired of pointless arguments. Just sign the divorce agreement and send it back to me. If there's anything you're unhappy with, we can negotiate. He was silent for a moment, and then his voice dropped, colder than before. Do whatever you want. He hung up abruptly. His words didn't bother me as much as I thought they would because, by then, Yi Ming had arrived at my doorstep, ready for another meal. Lately, it was as if he had installed a camera in my house. Whenever I finished cooking, the doorbell would ring almost immediately, but he never came empty-handed. Each time, he brought something with him, whether it was a fresh durian, a set of exquisite tableware, or an ancient tea cake. If I refused to accept his gifts, he would insist, saying that he couldn't finish or use everything by himself and that I should take them so he'd have something to mooch off when he came over next time. He also helped me with chores every time he visited, which was incredibly convenient. Eventually, I stopped refusing and accepted him as my regular dinner companion. One evening, I planned to try a duck stew recipe from my old cookbook. So I went out to buy some duck. It happened to be a discount night at the supermarket, so I took my time browsing. On my way back home, though, I started to feel like someone was following me. I glanced over my shoulder and, under the dim street light, saw a man walking slowly behind me. Something didn't feel right. I could have sworn I saw the same man when I left the supermarket earlier. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. I didn't know if I was just being paranoid, but I quickened my pace, hoping to leave him behind. But he kept following me. Even as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I rushed inside, slamming the door shut and locking it as fast as I could. Peeking through the peephole, I saw nothing. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking the danger had passed. But later that night, when I got up to use the bathroom, I realized the power had gone out. I couldn't shake the feeling that I heard faint noises coming from outside the door. Mustering all my courage, I looked through the peephole again, but the hallway was pitch black. Still, an unsettling thought crept into my mind. There was someone out there. I backed away from the door, a chill running down my spine. I didn't know if I was overthinking things, but I quickly called 110, the emergency number. The police station was far from my apartment, and the officer on the phone told me it would take about 20 minutes for them to arrive. He advised me to stay safe in the meantime. The noises outside grew louder, and tears welled up in my eyes as fear overtook me. Without thinking, I dialed Lu Shuming's number. He picked up almost immediately. Hello? Leaning against the locked bedroom door, I whispered shakily, Lu Shuming. Before I could finish, he cut me off, his voice dripping with contempt. Regretting it already? Su Lan, Weren't you acting all tough before? My entire body trembled, but I no longer cared about his attitude. Lu Shuming, there's someone scratching at my door. I'm scared. Can you? But what could he do? I realized I had called him out of habit, seeking comfort in my moment of fear. But Lu Shuming just laughed. He sneered, Su Lan, if you're going to backtrack, at least come up with a better excuse. The words I had wanted to say got stuck in my throat. I remained silent for a long time before hanging up. I wasn't disappointed. I just stared at the glowing phone screen, feeling strangely empty. After all, I had already decided to divorce him. His reaction didn't surprise me. But for some reason, I felt incredibly weary, my chest hollow as though any passing breeze could cut through me. Even the fear that had gripped me moments ago began to numb. Replaced by exhaustion, the noises outside seemed to stop. But then I heard a cold, authoritative voice. What do you think you're doing? It was Yi Ming's voice. The sound of something heavy hitting the floor followed. I rushed to open the door. Yi Ming stood shirtless in the hallway, wearing only gray sweatpants, glaring down at a small, ugly middle-aged man pinned beneath him. I asked you a question. Yi Ming's voice was ice cold. What are you doing, lurking outside someone's door in the middle of the night? The man groaned, his eyes filled with fear as he glanced up at Yi Ming's tall, muscular frame. I didn't do anything. I just got the wrong house. Yi Ming let out a cold laugh and reached for the man. But the stranger turned out to be surprisingly agile. He rolled away and bolted down the stairs. Yi Ming cursed under his breath and vaulted over the railing, grabbing the man by the collar mid-flight. The man panicked and slipped out of his shirt, abandoning it as he fled into the night. Damn it, Yi Ming cursed under his breath, turning to look at my panicked expression. But in the end, he chose to come back and comfort me. That night, the police arrived to take my statement, explaining that the man likely cut my power, waiting for me to step outside. Thankfully, I hadn't gone out alone, otherwise, who knows what could have happened. After the police left, I asked Yi Ming, why were you outside at that time? He was still frustrated about not catching the man. I had just finished working out. I heard some noise outside, so I went to check. I looked at him, my face pale with shock, and said, I really don't know what I would have done without you. Thank you. Yi Ming stared at me for a moment before pulling me into a sudden embrace. His warmth seeped through my thin nightgown, his breath enveloping me. I should have pushed him away. But in that moment, the panic inside me eased. We stood there in the dim hallway, his smooth, firm back pressed against me, offering a sense of security. The faint scent of cigarettes hung in the stifling air, like an invisible net wrapping around me. There was something unspoken, something stirring between us. My heart raced, and feeling awkward, I gently pulled away. Thank you. Wait a moment, Yi Ming said, his expression unchanged, as he turned back into his apartment, returning with a pillow and a blanket. He probably won't come back, but just in case, I'll stay here tonight. His tone was so casual, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I wanted to refuse, but the words caught in my throat. Was it really okay for a man and a woman, newly acquainted, to stay together like this? Don't worry, he said, reading my mind. With a smile, he added, I'll sleep on the sofa. If you're still worried, just lock your door and get some sleep. Despite my earlier fear, knowing Yi Ming was just outside made me feel strangely safe. That night, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. I woke up to the smell of something comforting. Groggily, I thought I was still dreaming. Slipping on my slippers, I wandered into the living room, only to find Yi Ming in the kitchen, wearing an apron. Seeing me, he raised a spatula and said, You're awake? Go wash up. I've made congee for breakfast. I leaned against the wall, momentarily confused. I was no longer at the age where a bowl of congee could stir my heart. Yet in this moment, a sense of warmth filled me. When Yi Ming placed the bowl of sweet congee in front of me, I couldn't help but say, I didn't expect you to know how to cook. He grinned proudly. I don't, but I can follow instructions. I watched a video and didn't skip a single step. I laughed. Thank you, but really, you didn't have to do this. I could have cooked. Yi Ming suddenly stopped smiling, looking at me seriously. Su Lan, cooking is your hobby, not your obligation. No one should be forced to cook for someone else. You don't have to. His words left me stunned. What I had said was purely out of habit, after all. I'd spent years cooking for Lu Shuming. He never cooked, and even when I was sick, it was the housekeeper who prepared meals, not him. I had never imagined that someone would tell me that cooking was a choice, not a duty. That someone would cook for me and say I didn't need to. Lowering my head, I realized that maybe, for the past 7 years, I had been wrong. Lu Shuming hadn't been wrong to say I shouldn't have revolved my entire life around him. I had thought I was doing what was best for both of us. But now I understood, marriage shouldn't be about one person constantly yielding and sacrificing. Before leaving, Yi Ming smiled softly and said, "If anything happens, just call me." Then, with a slight grin, he added, "Don't be afraid, I'm here." My small restaurant slowly started coming together, its decor reflecting my personal taste. There weren't many tables, as I was managing the place on my own and couldn't handle too many customers at once. I planned to open after finalizing the menu, choosing an auspicious day for the grand opening. The busyness of preparing the menu left me feeling fulfilled. And it wasn't until I received an alert from my home security system that I realized I hadn't thought about Lu Shuming in a while. The alert showed that someone unfamiliar had entered the house. Opening the video feed, I saw Ha Linlin struggling to help a drunken Lu Shuming onto the sofa. He winced, curling up slightly as the familiar pain in his stomach returned. "Medicine," he mumbled weakly. Frantic, Ha Linlin rummaged through the cabinets but couldn't find his medication. With no other choice, she ordered food and medicine from a delivery service. Handing him a glass of warm water, she said, "The medicine will be here soon. Just hold on a little longer." But when the medicine arrived, it wasn't the kind he usually took. After swallowing it, his pained expression didn't improve. Ha Linlin didn't know that his stomach medication came from a specialized hospital far away. A place I had painstakingly researched. Every 3 months, rain or shine, I'd make the trip to get the prescription and stock it at home, ensuring that he was never without it for the last 7 years. When his stomach acted up, I'd also make a special broth for him, soothing the pain after he took his medication. In fact, his stomach had nearly healed a few years ago, thanks to my care. But this past year, with him coming home less and his eating habits becoming irregular, the illness had returned. Now that I was gone, no one was there to fetch his medicine, and the supply had likely run out. No one was there to cook the broth for him, either. Suddenly, he pulled Ha Linlin into his arms, burying his face in her neck. At first, her face turned red, and she hesitantly raised her hand to embrace him. But when she heard his whispered words, she froze, her expression turning cold. "Su Lan," he muttered. I stared at my phone screen, unsure of how to process what I was feeling. "I'm not Su Lan." Ha Linlin's voice trembled as she tried to free herself. Shuming, you've got the wrong person." Lu Shuming struggled to open his eyes, and when he finally saw her, he instinctively pushed her away. "Who are you? Where's Su Lan?" he shouted. "Get out, Su Lan, Su Lan." Ha Linlin's face darkened with anger, so palpable it seemed to drip from her. She stood up, humiliated, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the house. I put my phone down and closed my eyes. In the middle of the night, the sound of trucks outside woke me up. Groggy, I picked up my phone to check the time and noticed that Lu Shuming was still sitting in the living room. He looked like he'd sobered up, sitting silently in the dark, his figure bathed in loneliness. After a while, he got up and rummaged through the drawers, looking for his stomach medication. But, as expected, the drawer was empty. He crouched down for a moment, lost in thought, and then slumped to the floor, lighting a cigarette. Smoking would only aggravate his condition, but he seemed beyond caring. I didn't feel any satisfaction, only a sense of weariness. I watched him for a moment before setting my phone aside and going back to sleep. The next morning, when I woke up, I found Lu Shuming still in the living room, surrounded by cigarette butts. He had stayed up all night. While I was sitting in my living room watching TV, it started raining heavily, the droplets shattering against the window before sliding down in long streaks. Niu, my little cat, was curled up beside me, purring softly. My phone rang, and it was Ha Linlin. "Su Lan," she began, "we need to talk." I was eating durian that Yi Ming had bought for me, and I couldn't help but frown. What could we possibly need to talk about? If you've already decided to divorce him, what's the point of lingering? Are you trying to play hard to get? Or are you regretting your decision? I rolled my eyes. "I have no idea what you're talking about." I was about to hang up when she snapped, her tone laced with fury. "Stop pretending. If it weren't for you clinging to him, why else would Shuming be so cold to me these past few days? Let me tell you, what you're doing is pointless. Do you know what he said about you? He told me he's tired of you always hovering around him, that you're suffocating him, He said I remind him of his youth and that he feels alive when he's with me. I couldn't help but chuckle. Oh, is that so? If he likes you that much, why don't you go find him? Where is he now? Just then, there was a knock on the door. Thinking it was the milk tea I had ordered, I slipped on my slippers and went to open it. Ha Linlin fell silent for a moment before biting out. He went looking for you. Satisfied? Her voice dripped with venom. Su Lan, even if you manage to take him back, it won't matter. Sooner or later, he'll get bored of you again. Once a cheater, always a cheater. He'll come to realize who he really loves eventually. Her audacity stunned me, but I couldn't believe Lu Shuming would come looking for me after all this time. We hadn't spoken for weeks. I didn't want to waste my breath on her, so I simply said, "Enough with your nonsense. You're disgusting," and hung up. But when I opened the door, I was the one who froze. There stood Lu Shuming, drenched from head to toe, his lips pale, staring at me with a miserable look on his face. He had actually come. "What are you doing here?" I asked, confused. "I told you to send a divorce agreement by mail. There was no need to bring it in person." He looked at me for a long time, then suddenly said, "Su Lan, come back home." I couldn't help but laugh. After a year of constant fighting, 6 months of cold silence, and 2 months of divorce negotiations, and now he shows up at my door asking me to come back? "Are you out of your mind?" I said, trying to close the door. Just then, my upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Wang, came down. "Oh no, my electric scooter is still outside." I didn't expect the rain to come so suddenly. She looked at Lu Shuming, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Miss Su, who is this man?" I felt a surge of warmth at her concern. "He's an old friend," I replied, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Wang." "Oh, I see," she said, her gaze softening as she looked at him more closely. Her eyes lit up. "Goodness, Miss Su, your friend is very handsome. Does he have a girlfriend?" "I have a niece, he's already married," I interrupted. "Oh," Mrs. Wang pouted, disappointment clear on her face as she gave him one last glance. What a shame. As soon as she left, Lu Shuming blocked the door with his hand, looking flustered. "That night, did you really mean it? Did someone really try to unlock your door?" His voice was cautious. I stared coldly at him. "Do you think I made that up?" His expression grew more complicated. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Save it," I said with a bitter smile. "If I'd waited for you to save me, I wouldn't be standing here. Keep your useless apologies to yourself." "Su Lan," he said, gripping my hand, water dripping from his soaked hair. "I mean it this time. I know I've been terrible, but we've come so far. Does it really have to end like this? If you come back, I'll transfer Ha Linlin to another branch. You won't have to see her again. I promise." I looked at the man I had once loved so deeply, but now everything felt so distant. Like a faded memory, Lu Shuming wanted to bury everything, to have me revolve around him again as if nothing had happened. He wanted me to pretend that his betrayal meant nothing. But how could I? How could anyone accept being betrayed by the person they loved? Yet, he spoke as if he was sure I would endure it. All because he knew I loved him. He was using my love as a weapon to keep me. I had never seen it more clearly than in that moment. My pure, youthful love had been twisted and worn down by time. No longer the same. "Get lost," I said, trying to shut the door. But he blocked it again. "Su Lan," he said, confused. "Isn't this all about Ha Linlin? What do you want from me? What do I have to do?" The strength difference between a man and a woman was too great. He easily kept the door open. But just then, a voice came from behind me. "Su Lan, who's at the door?" I turned around to see Yi Ming, wrapped in nothing but a towel, drying his damp hair with another. His well-defined muscles formed a perfect V-shape at his hips. Lu Shuming's movements froze. After a tense moment, Lu Shuming looked at me, fury flashing in his eyes. "Su Lan, who is he?" I opened my mouth to speak, but Yi Ming stepped forward and wrapped his arm around me. Flashing a bright smile, he extended his hand to Lu Shuming. "You must be Su Lan's ex-husband, right? I've heard a lot about you. Nice to meet you. I'm her current husband." What nonsense. Yi Ming had only come over to use my shower because his water heater had broken. Strangely enough, I didn't refute Yi Ming's claim, silently agreeing with him. Lu Shuming's face turned pale. For a moment, I thought he might turn around and leave, but instead, he took a deep breath, suppressing his emotions, and tried to stay calm. "Su Lan, I understand you're upset and going out to have fun. I don't mind." The phrase "I don't mind" sounded like he was gritting his teeth. Trying to hold back, he closed his eyes. If you come back now, we can pretend this never happened. For a second, I almost wanted to applaud him. What was this? Some grand gesture from a saintly wife. I sneered. Lu Shuming, are you saying that since you've cheated, we're even now, and we can just live under the same roof like nothing ever happened? He said nothing, but his eyes gave away that this was exactly what he thought. I found it ridiculous, suddenly not understanding the love I had been protecting for years. Somewhere along the way, it had morphed into something ugly and terrifying without me realizing it. Yi Ming burst out laughing. He looked Lu Shuming up and down, a smile playing on his lips. I heard you found yourself a younger woman. Well, who wouldn't want someone youthful and full of energy, right? He held me tighter. Lai Lai likes youth too. I'm only 21, and she has me now. Why would she go back to someone old and worn out like you? Everything you have, I have too, and what you don't have, I do. Wake up, old man. He kept calling him old man politely, but every word was a blow to Lu Shuming's pride. Watching his face darken, I worried for a moment that he might collapse from sheer rage. All right, we need to rest now. Do you have money? If not, I can transfer some for you to get a hotel. Yi Ming squeezed my waist, his expression full of innuendo. It's late, and we have a lot to take care of. Before he could finish, Lu Shuming punched him square in the face. Well, with a mouth like that, it wasn't surprising he got hit. Yi Ming didn't get angry though. He just laughed, wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth before landing a punch to Lu Shuming's stomach. Already weakened by his stomach issues, Lu Shuming groaned in pain, his face contorting. In the narrow hallway, the two men began fighting like wild animals. Enough. I rushed forward, stepping between them, glaring at Lu Shuming. Are you insane? The aggressiveness Yi Ming had shown moments before vanished as he grabbed my arm. Pouting like a child. Lai Lai, look at him. He hit me. It really hurts. Are you defending him? Lu Shuming asked, his voice incredulous. He didn't even bother wiping the blood from his face as he exploded in frustration. Su Lan, we've been together for 10 years. And now you're taking his side? You've only known him for a few days. Yes, I answered, smiling faintly. But back then, didn't you defend Ha Linlin in front of me? His face went blank. Lu Shuming, stop disturbing my life. We are done. Lu Shuming stared at me, speechless. Even after being punched by Yi Ming, he had stayed composed. But after hearing those words, his entire body seemed to sag, as if the strength had been drained out of him. Fine, he muttered after a long pause, his smile bitter. Su Lan, you're tough. He stumbled down the stairs, his figure shadowed under the dim hallway light, casting long, dark shadows across his face. I stood frozen, a sharp pain piercing my heart like tiny needles. Thank you, I said softly to Yi Ming, trying to steady my voice. Let me clean up your wound. I pulled him into the living room and started disinfecting the cut on his lip. He gazed down at me, his handsome face looking a little wild with the injury. We were standing so close, our breaths mingling. I could smell my body wash on him. Does it hurt? I asked. Yi Ming spoke suddenly. Everything I said earlier, I meant it. He looked at me, his eyes serious, unwavering. Su Lan, think about me. I'm good looking. I come from a wealthy family. I'm young and talented. He emphasized talented. I'm nothing like your ex. Just try being with me. I couldn't help but laugh at his straightforward, almost rogue-like confidence. What's so funny? He seemed a little displeased. I really like you. I continued applying the antiseptic, my tone calm. That's not love. It's just a fleeting interest. You should find a girl your age. We're not a good match. Yi Ming fell silent, his face stretching into disappointment. Pleading with you here, he said. I'm 21, not 12. I know the difference between infatuation and genuine feelings. He sighed deeply, his expression softening. Su Lan, I really like you. That dumb ex of yours never deserved you. I put the iodine back on the shelf. That's enough. I didn't want to admit it, but I was moved. Yi Ming, for all his cockiness, had reason to be confident. As he had said, it was hard not to feel something for a man like him. A 21-year-old, handsome, and full of life, looking you straight in the eye, saying he likes you. Who wouldn't be moved? But I had already lost once. I couldn't go through that again. In this world, promises are both the most beautiful and the most fragile things. We sat in silence for a long time as I finished treating his wound. Before leaving, Yi Ming said, Su Lan, I know your marriage hurt you. It's normal for you to be cautious. But I'll prove to you that if you choose me, I'll never hurt you. When my friends heard I was getting a divorce, they gently tried to dissuade me. You've been with Lu Shuming through all his hard times. Now that he's successful, you're just going to let him go? Don't you feel like it's a waste? Exactly. I heard he's distanced himself from that woman. He used to take her everywhere. But lately, he's been keeping her at a distance. It seems he even transferred her to another branch. Men play around outside sometimes. But as long as they come home, give you money, isn't that enough? They meant well, and I couldn't say their words were entirely wrong. But that wasn't the life I wanted. Life is too short to waste on a man who no longer loves you. Returning to Beijing felt surreal. I had only been gone for a few months. But everything felt unfamiliar. Lu Shuming picked me up. The bruises on his face had mostly healed. And we didn't speak much during the ride. As we got out of the car, he murmured, "Thank you." I nodded. "Your grandmother was kind to me. It's only right I come to visit her." His grandmother was gravely ill. And the only thing she still cared about was her family. She said she wanted to see both of us together one last time. Since her health was so poor, Lu Shuming had asked me not to tell her about our divorce. I agreed. After all, his grandmother had always treated me well. I still remember when we were dating. She learned I liked smoked meat. Every year, she'd make a batch for me. Despite her age, the whole family would tell her not to. But she'd just smile and say, "Lai Lai likes it." In just a few short months, she had become frail. Her body reduced to skin and bones. Her face, once full of warmth, was now hollow and lined with deep wrinkles. Her eyes were half closed most of the time. But when she saw us, they lit up with a faint glimmer. Slowly, she extended her thin, withered hand toward me. "Lai Lai, you've come?" Tears stung my eyes. "Grandma," I couldn't speak. She looked at us both, her lips curling into a weak smile. "It's all right. Don't cry. Everyone has their day. Don't cry." Her voice was a whisper. "I've lived long enough. Seeing the two of you happy together, I can rest easy now." Lu Shuming held my hand tightly, his voice hoarse. "Grandma, we'll live well together, I promise." She rested for a moment, then turned to him, her voice barely audible. "Shuming, Lai Lai has been by your side all these years. Now that you've found success, don't let her down, okay?" She took a shaky breath. "Sincerity." Her voice cracked. "The most precious thing in life is sincerity. Having someone who is sincere with you, that is something money can't buy." Lu Shuming's hand trembled. "Yes, Grandma." When she fell asleep, we left the room. Lu Shuming stood by the window, pulling out a cigarette, but after a moment, he clenched it tightly in his hand without lighting it. We stood in silence until he finally spoke. "Su Lan, I finally understand where I went wrong." His voice was quiet. "I thought I was tired of our repetitive life. The same meals, the same routines, but now I see how much effort you put into everything. While you were gone, I did a lot of thinking. It wasn't that I loved Ha Linlin. It was just the novelty." He paused. "I broke up with her. I promise I won't make the same mistake again. Let's start over. We can have a child. Build a happy family of 3. His face was filled with hope, as if he genuinely believed in the future he was describing. But I found it laughable. "A child, so they can inherit your cheating genes?" His smile faltered. He sighed. "I know I hurt you deeply. It's okay, Su Lan. You always waited for me before. This time, I'll wait for you." His voice was steady, determined. "I won't give up." I felt nauseated. I wanted to visit his grandmother one last time before leaving for good. But before I could take a step, I heard the sound of high heels approaching rapidly, followed by an angry voice. "Lu Shuming, did you break up with me just to get back with her?" I turned around, stunned to see Ha Linlin. Lu Shuming rubbed his temples. "Why are you here?" Her voice was choked with emotion. "You think you can just walk away after everything?" "I'm pregnant, Shuming. Then get rid of it." His tone didn't waver. "I have a wife. I don't need someone else giving me a child." Ha Linlin staggered back, disbelief washing over her face as tears streamed down her cheeks. She couldn't comprehend how the man who had once been so intimate with her could be so cold and heartless now. I wasn't surprised. Lu Shuming was selfish. He didn't truly love me or Ha Linlin. The only person he ever loved was himself. If he could abandon someone he'd been with for 10 years, it was no shock that he could discard her after less than a year. Just when I thought Ha Linlin would leave in despair, she suddenly gritted her teeth and burst into the hospital room. Bang! The door slammed against the wall, startling Lu Shuming's grandmother awake. Ha Linlin stormed over to her bedside, pointing at me. Grandma, Lu Shuming and her are divorced. I'm the one who's his wife now. She held up a sonogram, thrusting it in the old woman's face. Look, this could be your great-grandson. The elderly woman's brow furrowed, her face filled with displeasure. Her frail hand trembled as she reached out toward Lu Shuming, as if trying to say something. Grandma, please help me, Ha Lin begged. Tell him to stay with me. I'm carrying his child. How could he abandon his own flesh and blood? The grandmother's face flushed red. I could tell something was wrong and rushed forward to pull Ha Lin away. Let her go, I shouted, but the old woman's hand froze in midair. Her eyes locked on Lu Shuming's as her face turned ashen, then ghostly white. Her hand fell limp, unmoving. We all stood there in shock, frozen by what had just happened. A few seconds later, I screamed, "Doctor, doctor," but it was too late. She was gone. The doctor later said she had been at the end of her life. With proper rest, she could have lasted a few more days, but the emotional shock had been too much for her frail body. Ha Lin stood in the corner, trembling, unable to believe what she had done. Maybe she had only wanted the old woman to speak up for her, to convince Lu Shuming to stay. But as she reached out timidly to touch Lu Shuming's arm, he slowly turned toward her. The air in the room seemed to freeze, his gaze filled with a terrifying coldness I had never seen before. Slap. The sound of his hand hitting her face echoed in the room as she stumbled back, falling hard onto the floor. Blood trickled from her split lip as she clutched her face, staring at him in shock. His voice was icy, each word cutting. Get out. Moments later, Lu Shuming's father appeared, his eyes red with grief. He kicked his son hard in the side. This is all your fault. You couldn't be content with what you had. Had to go chasing after something else. And now you've killed your grandmother. He lunged to hit his son again, and Ha Lin threw herself between them, trying to stop the violence. Meanwhile, Lu Shuming continued to yell at her to leave, and she kept crying that she was carrying his child. Exhausted by the whole scene, I left before the drama played out any further. Whatever happened next didn't concern me anymore. The only thing that saddened me was the grandmother, a kind woman who had never had a moment of peace in her final days. The funeral took place a few days later. I lit incense for her and left quietly. Lu Shuming's mother held my hand tightly, unable to speak through her sobs. I patted her hand gently. The truth was, the Lu family had been good to me, but my time with them had run its course. When I got home, I threw myself into preparing for the restaurant's grand opening. There was still a lot to do, and fortunately, Yi Ming was always there to help. On the first day of winter snow, while tidying up the house, I found an old tin box. Inside were the letters Lu Shuming had written to me back when we were in high school. We didn't have mobile phones then, and we communicated through handwritten letters every day. I paused, holding one of the letters in my hand. Su Lan, let's go to school together tomorrow. Lately, there's this girl who keeps following me around. I told her I have a girlfriend, but she doesn't believe me. How annoying. My mom made some amazing dumplings today. Come over tomorrow and have some with me. I got called out by the teacher today. She talked about us dating too early, saying we're too young and it's just infatuation, claiming we'd break up in a few days. What nonsense. We'll always be together, forever. I looked at the letter, and a memory suddenly resurfaced. When I was 18, Lu Shuming and I buried a time capsule under the camphor tree at school, filled with messages about our future together. We promised we would dig it up 10 years later. If I calculate it, this year marks the 10-year anniversary. I don't even remember what we wrote back then. A complicated feeling washed over me, and I decided to dig it up. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped. There, standing in front of my building, was Lu Shuming, covered in a thick layer of snow. It looked like he had been standing there for a long time. What are you doing here? I frowned reflexively. Lu Shuming's lips moved slightly. Su Lan, I came to apologize. His voice was soft, hesitant. I've thought about it a lot, and I realized I owe you an apology. I lowered my head, walking past him. There's no need. The best way to apologize is to never appear in front of me again. He grabbed my hand, his eyes bloodshot. Su Lan, what do I have to do for you to come back? I was about to shake him off when I suddenly changed my mind. I pulled out the letter he had written me all those years ago and handed it to him. I'm going to dig up the time capsule we buried. Do you want to come? It had been 10 years since I last visited the school, but not much had changed. The teaching building had a fresh coat of paint, and the sports field had been renovated, but the small store outside the school still stood, albeit with a larger sign. We went in, and the store owner, much older now, no longer remembered us, but he smiled kindly and handed us 2 cups of hot drinks. The camphor tree seemed much bigger than I remembered, its branches now laden with snow, occasionally dropping small clumps that dissolved into the wind. I borrowed a shovel from the store owner and, relying on my memory, began to dig. The ground was frozen solid, and after a few minutes of struggling, Lu Shuming took the shovel from me, stomping hard to drive it into the earth. The small stone we used as a marker was gone, but after sweating and digging for what seemed like ages, we finally uncovered the rusted tin box. Carefully, Lu Shuming pulled it out and opened it, revealing the bright-colored plastic inside, still vivid as if it had been buried just yesterday. However, the paper inside had yellowed with time. The handwriting on the notes was immature, almost childlike. First wish, marry Su Lan. Second wish, stay with Su Lan forever. The 18-year-old Lu Shuming had sent a message to his 28-year-old self. Lu Shuming, 10 years from now, have my wishes come true? They definitely have. Below that was my own handwriting. I want to be with Lu Shuming forever too. The promises of youth seemed to echo in my ears. But 10 years later, everything had changed. Lu Shuming stared blankly at the note, frozen in place as the snow continued to fall around him. His fingers began to tremble, and when he finally looked up, tears were streaming down his face. Su Lan, he choked. I know what you want now. I smiled faintly, tearing the note into small pieces and tossing it into the snow. The fragments scattered in the wind, swirling up before disappearing into the air, never to be seen again. At that moment, I never thought that our 7-year marriage would end in such humiliation and despair. The promises of our youth had been like arrows, flying through the years only to pierce my heart in the end. Su Lan from 10 years ago, your wishes did not come true. Lu Shuming and we must now part ways. I dusted off my hands and stood up. Let's go. But before I could take a step, Lu Shuming grabbed hold of me, dropping to his knees in the snow. Su Lan, I beg you, he cried. Give me another chance. I swear I'll never hurt you again. His head hung low, tears falling into the snow and leaving tiny dents. Don't leave me. I stood in silence, feeling utterly hollow inside. I shoved my hands into my pockets, looking down at him calmly. Lu Shuming, stop it. It's embarrassing. I walked away, and when I looked back, he was still kneeling in the snow, slowly being buried by the falling flakes. Yi Ming had disappeared. Since that day, I lost all contact with him. Just as suddenly as he had entered my life, he vanished during that snowy day, and I never saw him again. I felt a bit sad, but after what I had been through with Lu Shuming and knowing I hadn't known Yi Ming for long, I eventually let go. I figured he was young, and perhaps his words back then had been nothing more than youthful impulsiveness. We were never meant to be part of the same world, and after briefly crossing paths, we returned to our own lives. Fortunately, my restaurant finally opened, and I named it Su Family Eatery. Once I expand, I plan to rename it Su Family Restaurant. Customers praised my cooking, and within days, the place became crowded with regulars, even drawing attention online. The business picked up so quickly that I had to hire 2 more staff members. Gradually, I thought less about Yi Ming, but sometimes, when I returned home and saw that the door next to mine remained closed, I still felt a strange sense of loss. Then one day, after a busy day at work, I came home and froze in place. Yi Ming was in the kitchen, wearing an apron, with my cat, Niu Niu, perched on his shoulder. He looked up and smiled at me. You're home. I felt a bit disoriented. The scene was so familiar, like we were back to how things had been half a year ago when we were still so in sync. Yi Ming bit his lip, quickly striding over to hug me tightly. It was a fierce embrace, as if he wanted to meld me into his body. He buried his face into my shoulder. I'm sorry, he explained. That day, my father suddenly had me taken back. He said his health was failing and forced me to return, demanding I marry someone of his choice and take over the family business. I refused, so he confiscated my phone, locked me up, and said he wouldn't let me go until I agreed. He pulled up his pant leg, showing me the ugly scars on his calf. Smiling bitterly, I jumped out of a window but got caught. Stunned, I instinctively reached out to touch the scars. Does it still hurt? Yi Ming's gaze softened. It hasn't hurt for a long time. Then how did you manage to get out? I asked. The game I developed was nearly finished before I got taken back. My team released it as planned, and it exploded, making over 80 million in its first week, with profits soaring after that. I went on a hunger strike to protest. And when my father realized he couldn't control me anymore and that I already had my own career, he had no choice but to let me hire someone else to manage the family business. He spoke lightly, but I could see how much thinner he had become, how gaunt his face was. It was clear this battle hadn't been as easy as he made it seem. Yi Ming hugged me tightly, his voice trembling. Su Lan, what do? I broke my promise. I said I would wait for you. But I disappeared without a word. You must have been so sad. I remained silent, gently patting his back. Snow had begun to fall again outside. And Yi Ming's voice was laced with emotion. You have no idea how much I missed you. My father wanted me to marry someone else. And the whole time I was terrified that you would go back to your ex or be taken by someone else. I teased him. Well, my ex did keep asking me to reconcile. I've been thinking about it these past few days. Yi Ming didn't respond, simply staring at me with his intense, sharp gaze. He had single eyelids, and when he looked down, the corners of his eyes lifted slightly, his features angular, giving him an air of dominance. But instead of getting angry like he usually did, he simply said, "Dinner's ready. I made beef stew with red wine." He had used a $30 bottle of Screaming Eagle to cook the stew. I was horrified. You're so wasteful. Yi Ming just smiled, nonchalant. That wine wouldn't even make it into my father's wine cellar. I had some left over. Don't let it go to waste. Let's drink it together. I didn't question it. That night, I lost track of how much we drank. We started with half a bottle but somehow ended up opening a new one. Eventually, I was laughing and crying, rambling nonsense, almost rolling under the table. Yi Ming helped me up, holding me close as I babbled on, quietly responding to everything I said with soft murmurs. By the time I woke up, it was the middle of the night. My head was still a little fuzzy, and I debated whether to get up to use the bathroom. Yi Ming stepped out of the bathroom, a towel loosely wrapped around his waist, droplets of water still glistening on his toned muscles. I stared blankly, my mind wandering. Hadn't he been locked up by his father? How had he managed to keep such a perfect body? But then I quickly realized something was off. Yi Ming stood by the window, looking down at me, and with one hand, he pulled off the towel. The moonlight highlighted his strong, handsome features, giving him an almost devilish allure. He didn't say a word, but I shivered despite myself. What are you doing? I asked, trying to prop myself up, instinctively retreating. Yi Ming smirked, flashing a set of perfectly white teeth. I'm going to make you mine. The next morning, we hadn't solidified our relationship. But when he asked me again about becoming official, I hesitated. His gaze was as intense as ever, like he wanted to devour me. I feared the promises of a young man, afraid that one day, I would end up in the same place as I had with Lu Shuming. I couldn't face that again. So, we made a pact. 3 years. If after 3 years, he still loved me and chose me, then we would be together. Time passed slowly, and my restaurant became an online sensation, packed with customers every day. I even opened 2 more locations. I rebranded the restaurant from Su Family Eatery to Su Family Tavern. I studied traditional recipes, experimented with new dishes, and to my surprise, they were well received. Everything seemed to fall into place. The past, like a distant cloud, faded away. Occasionally, I would hear bits of news about old acquaintances. The scandal involving Lu Shuming and Ha Linlin was infamous for a time. I later learned that Ha Linlin had never been pregnant. She had faked the pregnancy, hoping to trap Lu Shuming, intending to get pregnant later to cover up the lie. But her actions had enraged his grandmother, leading to her death and severing the last thread of connection between Ha Linlin and Lu Shuming. I heard the Lu family had sought revenge, leaving Ha Linlin penniless, and after becoming addicted to gambling, she eventually sold her body to repay her debts. She roamed the underbelly of society, riddled with disease. Her current whereabouts were unknown, and whether she was alive or dead was anyone's guess. The next time I heard about Lu Shuming was through a phone call from a mutual friend. She said he had suffered a stomach rupture from excessive drinking and needed surgery. After you left, he started drinking heavily, several times. He even vomited blood at work and had to be hospitalized. The doctors say this time it's serious. He might need part of his stomach removed. She sighed. You two were together for so many years. Can you really bear to let him go through this? She sent me a video. In it, Lu Shuming lay on a hospital bed, looking much thinner. His eyelids fluttered slightly as he slept. The confident man he once was now a mere shadow of his former self. I didn't say anything, simply hung up the phone. I thought about sending him a message but decided against it. This was the life he had chosen. His fate, and I didn't want to bear any responsibility for it anymore. And so, from the passionate love of our youth, we became strangers. It was probably for the best. The summer nights by the sea were cool, and Yi Ming and I often walked along the shore after sunset. The moonlight shimmered on the water as he playfully kicked the waves at my feet. I tried to catch him, but he grabbed my hand instead. A cold object slipped onto my finger. I looked down and saw a ring, its diamond sparkling softly in the moonlight. Stunned, I looked at him. Yi Ming knelt on one knee, gazing up at me. The stars seemed to gather in his eyes, and I saw my reflection in them. I love you, Su Lan. I blushed. Why so sudden? He told me he loved me every day, so much that I had grown used to it. But I hadn't expected this. What I mean is, he said seriously, Su Lan, it's been 3 years. I still love you, even more than I did before. I'm sure of my heart now. Will you marry me? I said nothing, just looked at him. He tilted his head. Su Lan? I smiled, pulling him up and standing on my tiptoes. Our kiss was cool, carried by the night breeze.